Welcome everyone to the Friends Meeting House, and thank you for coming out for this special event. My name is Terry Ginsberg, and I work with NIACT, New Yorkers Against the Cornell Technion Partnership, Brooklyn for Peace, New Yorkers Against the Cornell Technion Partnership, and the Peace and Social Action Committee of Brooklyn Monthly Meeting are proud to host Max Blumenthal and hope that this evening of discussion with him will further enlighten us all regarding the devastating and increasingly dire situation faced by Palestinians in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and the related effects of oppressive Israeli policy here in the US, such as the government practice of domestic surveillance against Arab, South Asian, and Muslim communities, and ongoing threats to the civil liberties of persons who would speak out against such policies and practices. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Max Blumenthal.
I want to talk about the collapse of the peace process. I want to talk about what that means for those of us who are campaigning for equal rights for Palestinians. I want to talk about Israel's response to the collapse of a peace process that has shielded it from international scrutiny and external pressure. But, you know, I follow the news and several events. Maybe it's because I have like a one-track mind and I'm just completely obsessed. Like my mother says, I'm too obsessive. That I'm obsessed with this, but they brought me back to Palestine, these news events. When I saw Jay Leno outside the Beverly Hills Hotel this week, protesting because the Beverly Hills Hotel is owned by the Sultanate of Brunei, and they have just implemented these very repressive anti-gay laws. And Jay Leno compared the Sultanate to Nazis and said, you know, this is just like 1933 Germany. The Holocaust is coming. Hello. I think, you know, it's better for him to do the questioning of celebrities than to offer any of his own viewpoints. But nevertheless, the State Department, which constantly tells Palestinians, has told Palestinians since the beginning of John Kerry's attempt to create a framework for a framework, in his words, to just come back to the negotiating table while Israel has built 50 new settlement units a day since the beginning of the framework for the framework. The State Department has said that this boycott is legitimate, that they consider this a legitimate boycott. The State Department, which has condemned BDS. The Stanford University just divested $20 million from the coal industry, according to its Code of Ethics of Socially Responsible Investment. This is the same Stanford University that denounced the American Studies Association for their boycott of Israeli educational institutions like the Technion, which are knee-deep in the occupation, which are heavily involved in the research and development sector of the occupation. And CNN has aired a powerful documentary about SeaWorld's abuse and imprisonment of wild orca whales and their exploitation of workers called Blackfish, which has led to a cultural boycott of SeaWorld, with musical acts refusing to perform at SeaWorld, and children telling their parents that they don't want to see these abused whales in captivity. And SeaWorld is bleeding profits thanks to CNN, the home of former APAC researcher Wolf Blitzer, airing this powerful documentary, muckraking journalism on an abusive, exploitative entity. And then there's the State of Israel, which has refused to take in any Syrian refugees that I know of because they're, you know, demographic threats, but just performed a dramatic and widely covered operation on a Syrian brown bear. I think they gave the brown bear back surgery, and this was covered in the international media as a sign of Israel's altruism and beneficence. And so it occurred to me that, you know, I had some ideas for Palestinians. You know, I wanted to mansplain to Palestinians for a second. That if they want to receive dignity from Israel, dignified treatment from Israel, or fair coverage from the mainstream American corporate media, if they want support from the US government, from the State Department, or if they want the support of elite American institutions, there's some things they need to do. They need to wear bear suits equipped with solar panels while speaking in complex sonar blasts like orca whales while walking down the red carpet at the Oscars. It really seems to me that that's the only way that they can make that happen. Of course, there's another option, which is that those of us who support Palestinian equal rights, who are heeding the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, take matters into our own hands, because none of this stuff is going to happen until we do so and create bottom-up pressure. The conditions are just not right among American elites, among the corporate media, and within U.S. government for anything positive to happen on this issue. That's why we're here tonight. So we also need to recognize that we're here tonight at an extremely opportune time for this kind of bottom-up grassroots organizing, Palestinian-led organizing around BDS. And it's because of the collapse of the peace process, which has been going on for decades, allowing Israel to continue to put new facts on the ground, to expand its project of Greater Israel, of illegal colonial settlements, of repression, of apartheid, while creating the impression in the U.S. that it is fighting for peace, and that it is interested in peace, and that this occupation and that the wall and the siege of Gaza are actually temporary projects if the Palestinians would just come to the table and negotiate away their future. But that's all over, and Martin Indyk, who was the chief negotiator for the State Department, who is a former researcher for AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby, who told a pro-Israel group in 2009 that he left Australia, where he's from, and moved to Washington, that he made aliyah to Washington in order to protect Israel's security imperatives. His words. This man, who is really the fox guarding the hen house, who has been the fox guarding the hen house, who has been Israel's lawyer, in the words of former negotiator Aaron David Miller, who's kind of like the junior lawyer, junior partner in the law firm. Martin Indyk has come out and told the most prominent columnist in Israel, Nahum Barnea, that the peace process is over and it's all Netanyahu's fault, it's Israel's fault. Even Martin Indyk has been forced to blame Israel. He did so anonymously, speaking on background, but we all know it's him. Another U.S. official was so upset by what happened, so upset with Israel's behavior, the Netanyahu government's behavior, that he said that I guess we need another intifada to get the peace process going again. That's how desperate the U.S. has become. Emil Nakle, who is a veteran academic, a former CIA analyst, and a member of the Palestinian intelligentsia, who is considered very conservative by other Palestinian intellectuals because he conceived the idea of a Palestinian state in the 1970s solely in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at a time when the PLO still believed in a kind of binational state with equal rights for all. Emil Nakle was actually attacked by Mr. Peace Process industry, Saeb Erekat, for advancing, in Erekat's words, the U.S. solution. Nakle has come out last week and said that the two-state solution is over. There is no way that it's physically or geographically or politically possible. We should do away with it and never speak of it again. And not only that, but the whole peace process has been a sham. So from the most conservative sectors within the peace process industry, there is a solid consensus that there will not be a US-led two-state solution anytime in the near future. And meanwhile, Israel continues to ethnically cleanse, continues to build settlements. What does this mean for Americans and for the US? Shibli Telhami, who is, to my knowledge, the only Arab American ever to serve on a US negotiating team on Israel-Palestine and is now at the Brookings Institute, in another conservative institution, actually at the Saban Center, funded by Haim Saban, who is one of the biggest bundlers for Barack Obama, and says he's a single-issue guy. His one issue is Israel. But don't call him an Israel firster. Telhami commissioned a really interesting poll 2 months ago, conducted by a GFK, which is a very reputable polling firm, and he asked Americans, 1,000 Americans across the political spectrum, if the two-state solution is deemed to be a failure and collapses, what do you favor, a democratic single state or a Jewish state? And by a margin of 64-20, American respondents to this poll declared that they favored a democratic single state to a Jewish state, which simply means that they just need to be informed that the two-state solution is over, khalas, and then they will come around to support the democracy that they claim to believe in their own country. Interestingly, if you look at the internals of these kinds of polls, you will find that support for democracy is heavily weighted towards those who self-identify as Democrats, members of the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, which is consumed with Christian Zionism, tends to favor the Jewish state solution. They have these shared values of white nationalism and Jewish nationalism. This is a party that's rooted in neo-Confederate traditions and sees as a beacon of light Netanyahu's Israel. And so what we're seeing play out in our elections is an incredibly undemocratic Democratic Party which refuses to embrace the mood and attitudes, the shifting attitudes of its grassroots base as it falls increasingly under the control of corporate interests, and a Republican Party that is using Israel as a kind of wedge issue like gay marriage and abortion, a Republican Party whose two top funders are Sheldon Adelson and Paul Singer, both extreme hardcore Zionists who place Israel as one of their paramount issues. And every candidate in the upcoming midterms and in the 2016 elections will have to kiss Sheldon Adelson, the casino baron's ring, and declare fealty to Netanyahu's Israel if they have any hope of receiving the nomination. If Rand Paul, however, receives the nomination, we could witness a bizarre exodus of neocons from the Republican Party into the camp of Hillary Clinton, who is receiving enormous support from Haim Saban and others like that. So John Kerry, who's gotten almost nothing right from Palestine to Cairo, where he said, you know, that Egypt was on the road to democracy. I mean, I don't know how many massacres it takes to convince him that you know, massacring people isn't democracy. I mean, how many mass death sentences does it take to convince him that something terribly authoritarian is happening? Kerry actually got something right when he warned Israelis and Netanyahu and his inner circle that if the peace process flops, you will get BDS on steroids. And that's what we're going to see. And that's what we're seeing in our own communities, and that's what we're seeing on campus. And this battle in the United States, as Ali Abunimah says in his essential new book, which you all should get, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, the battle will be decided on campus in the US, which is why the Zionist movement is investing so much of its resources to suppress protected speech on campus and actually reaching out and calling on state power to crush academic institutions like the American Studies Association, to suppress Palestine solidarity activism. The argument is over. There's no argument anymore. No one is going to challenge the facts that are in my book, which just happen to be the facts on the ground. I'm not, you know, some genius. I just wrote them down after documenting them. No one has challenged the facts in my book. Eric Alterman of The Nation, after trashing my book in 9 blog posts, transforming himself into a virtual internet stalker, conceded that my book is technically factually accurate. And that's because the argument is over. There will be no argument. There is only a call, activism, and this momentum for justice in Palestine versus an aggressive fighting retreat from the Israel lobby in the US. And it's the US that's the last bastion of pro-Israel support in the world. My book doesn't deal with the U.S., although obviously it has implications for how this will play out in the U.S. As I said before, my book is about Israel in the post-two-state solution era, in the post-peace process era, the post-Oslo era, what many Israelis would call the era of hafradah, or separation, unilateral separation on demographic lines, as manifested in the separation wall and the siege of the Gaza Strip. And there are many instances of kind of micro-hafradah within Israeli cities separating Palestinian citizens of Israel from Jews. My book, and what I intended to do with my book, was expose the reality of a Jewish ethnocracy and the illusion of a Jewish state as a democracy. Now, we've had liberal Zionists like Peter Beinart and Jeffrey Goldberg embracing this idea of liberalism and Zionism as two kinds of concepts that can exist in harmony. It's kind of like two states of mind. And right now, those are the only two states that liberal Zionists have left. The actual two states have been eviscerated, and my book addresses Israel-Palestine as a single unitary entity under the control of one apartheid regime with different matrices of domination for different populations defined according to ethnic and religious lines. Now, I don't need to tell you that Israel practices apartheid. I don't need to tell you that it discriminates on an institutional basis against anyone who is not Jewish. We can just listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, the thrice elected leader of Israel, who just introduced a new basic law in response to BDS, what he calls attacks on Israel's legitimacy, a law that will represent the funeral of liberal Zionism if it's passed. You have to understand what basic laws are. Israel has no constitution, partly because a constitution often will require you to define national borders. Whenever anyone accuses me of wanting to wipe Israel off the map, I hand them a piece of paper and a pen and I say, can you draw it for me? Because Israel has no defined national borders. Number two, the Constitution would cause a national crisis or a constitutional crisis because Israel is a Jewish state. That means it has to define what it means to be a Jew. Who is a Jew? And who is an Israeli? Israel has thrice redefined what a Jew is, readjusting it according to the imperatives of Zionism. This is an area that has been really under-acknowledged and scarcely researched in it. One of the few books in English I can think of is out of print about this issue, called The Un-Jewish State by Akiva Or, one of the founders of the anti-Zionist group Mutz Pen, and it's to Akiva Or that my book is dedicated, because he was such a mentor and teacher to me. He's no longer with us. So Israel has supplanted its constitution with these basic laws, and this new basic law that Netanyahu will introduce will permanently place Israel's Jewish character above its professed democratic charter forever, and define it permanently as an institutionally discriminatory apartheid state. Here's what Netanyahu said about the law. He said, this law will consolidate the fact that Israel is the nation state of one people only, the Jewish people, and of no other people. And therefore, in order to bolster the status of the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, we need to ratify it. One people only and no other people. He said it will protect individual rights of non-Jews. He didn't even refer to them that way. But he doesn't refer to them as another people because Israel doesn't recognize minorities as a group. They refer to them in Hebrew as members of minorities. That means that they can only be treated on an individual basis and not collectively as a minority group, because then they would be able to issue collective demands for things like affirmative action or refugee rights. This is very dangerous to the Jewish state. So this law will take that off the table for good. The law was timed for Independence Day. Independence Day is a holiday that Israel's just observed. And Independence Day, one of the most popular places to go is Canada Park, which is near Jerusalem. And it's a nice idyllic place. I've been there. There are trees and kind of a vast forest. It looks almost European. There are picnicking grounds. Israelis grill meats and sing nationalistic songs as Americans do on July 4th and watch fireworks. The interesting thing about Canada Park is that if you wander into those woods, you'll trip over the ruins of Beit Nuba and Yalu and Imwas, which was known as Emmaus in the New Testament, where Jesus met with some of his disciples. And you will consider the ruins of these Palestinian villages, which were ethnically cleansed in 1967, whose residents were forced from their homes at gunpoint and sent marching to Ramallah, never to return, after watching their homes demolished before their eyes. And so you could stumble upon the well of Yalu or the destroyed church of Imwas, this former Christian village, and consider what has been buried beneath these pine needles that have fallen from the trees installed by the Jewish National Fund, a 501c3 nonprofit that raises tens of millions of dollars in the US and builds forests deliberately above and over the ruins of Palestinian villages which have been ethnically cleansed to deliberately prevent their residents from returning, and which is extremely actively involved in the settlement enterprise in East Jerusalem. And you'll wonder what lies beneath those mountains of pine needles and those piles of lies. Palestinians, of course, know about what's buried beneath, what lies beneath the forest. It's their history, it's their heritage, it's their homes, it's their land. And that's why on Independence Day, Palestinians observe Nakba Day. The Nakba refers to the Palestinian catastrophe of 1947 and 1948, when 750,000 indigenous Palestinians were expelled and ethnically cleansed to enable Israel to establish itself as a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. This year, 10,000 Palestinians protested Israel's Independence Day, just as Frederick Douglass protested July 4th in the US, declaring that he could never see July 4th or America's foundation as anything but a crime until slavery was outlawed and discrimination against African Americans was completely abolished. And Avigdor Lieberman looked with great consternation on these Palestinian protests, these observances. Avigdor Lieberman is the foreign minister of Israel. He is the leader of the second largest party, which is currently in a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu's governing Likud party. Avigdor Lieberman is the second most popular politician in Israel. He is a former bouncer from Moldova and baggage handler at Ben Gurion International Airport, who was a right-wing thug at Hebrew University who attacked Palestinian students with bicycle chains, and has since become one of the major political figures and the possible successor to Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. Lieberman, who called for the drowning of Palestinian prisoners in the Dead Sea, who called for the bombing of the Aswan Dam in Egypt, which would have caused at least hundreds of thousands of casualties. Lieberman was described by Haaretz, the voice of the liberal Israeli public, as the last possible hope for peace, because Lieberman is the only viable successor to Netanyahu that I can think of who favors, at least rhetorically, a two-state solution. Of course, his two-state solution will require the transfer of 250,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel living in the north in the Arab Triangle by redrawing the borders around them. And so Lieberman comments on the Palestinian protests on Nakba Day, and he declares that Palestinian citizens of Israel are a fifth column. And he says, to those Arabs that took part in the Nakba Day procession and waved Palestinian flags, I suggest that next time they march directly to Ramallah and stay there. This is the second most popular politician in Israel. Lieberman represents what the Israeli geographer Oren Yiftachel describes as, or he advances what Yiftachel describes as vertical apartheid, whereas the economics minister, Naftali Bennett, who is the third most popular politician in Israel, another viable candidate for prime minister, advances horizontal apartheid, the project of greater Israel, of building out. Bennett wants to annex much of the West Bank so that Israel can build settlements legally, unfettered, to normalize the settlement project. Lieberman has said that even though he lives in the settlement of Nokdim, he will give up his settlement house if Israel can be recognized permanently as a Jewish state for one people only, and they can transfer out those 250,000 demographic threats in the north. That's very similar to the Labor Party's vision, to Yitzhak Rabin and Yossi Beilein's vision of the two-state solution, an extremely Jewish state separated by walls and this kind of panopticon surveillance system from a Palestinian state under the control of an authoritarian, autocratic Palestinian authority living in what Lieberman calls cantons. And so that's vertical apartheid. And it's why Lieberman campaigned in 2009 on the slogan of no loyalty, no citizenship, meaning that those Palestinian citizens of Israel, he's talking about Palestinian citizens, not those who are occupied, if they refuse to swear loyalty to the Jewish state and basically convert to Zionism, they will have their citizenship rights taken away. That's what Lieberman proceeded to do with his party, with the full support of the Likud party, and with support even from the Labor Party when it was run by Ehud Barak. It was Barak who supported the call, Netanyahu's bill, to advance loyalty oaths for anyone seeking Israeli citizenship, which would have applied to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. And one of the first things I did when I started writing my book was just to hang out in the Knesset and speak to these legislators who were advancing these laws, try to get a sense of what they believed. One person whose name was on so many of the laws was David Rotem, from Lieberman's party. He is a settler. He was the chair of the Constitution Committee in the Knesset, which is important, as I said, because Israel has no constitution, so they kind of make it up as they go along. And Rotem, when I met with him at his settlement home, he first explained to me why he would never let an Arab live next door to him. And he said, it's because when this home was being built, it was built by Palestinians, and I caught one of them writing his name on the wall. And I said, why are you writing your name on the wall? And he said, when you leave, it's going to be my house. And so he said, so I don't trust the Arabs. And then he told me, he looked into my eyes and he told me that the tyranny of the majority is the essence of democracy. And that really distills in one line the logic of Israel's right-wing rulers. In fact, that distills the logic of Zionism itself. And so we see these laws, like the anti-NGO laws imposing over 50% taxes on foreign donations for even Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, the acceptance to communities law, which has passed, which authorizes communities of under 500 to discriminate on the basis of race and religion, the law raising the electoral threshold to 4 seats, which could virtually eliminate Arab parties in the Knesset since all of them hold less than 4 seats, the Central Election Committee ruling against Hanin Zoabi, the most hated woman in Israel, because she belongs to the Balad party, which campaigns for Israel as a state of all its citizens, in other words, a state with no racial or religious preferences. The Central Elections Committee has twice banned her from running for Knesset. The Supreme Court overturned those rulings, and so the Knesset started introducing legislation that would allow it to invalidate Supreme Court rulings. Zoabi has been virtually physically attacked in the Knesset. She was handed an Iranian passport by the former Miss St. Petersburg, Anastasia Mikhaeli, who converted to Judaism in 1996 and became an Israeli citizen, and told Zoabi in the Knesset, as a member of Lieberman's party, to go back to Iran. It's why former Haaretz bureau chief Danny Rubenstein was compelled in 2010 to denounce what he saw as neo-Nazi expressions in the Knesset. And these laws, and many more like them, complement the 50 discriminatory, racist, and anti-democratic laws that are already on the book in Israel, which apply to its non-Jewish citizens, and which had begun being passed immediately at the dawn of the foundation of the State of Israel. One of the most interesting or important laws in my opinion, which I write about extensively in my book, is the Nakba law. This law was introduced by another one of Avigdor Lieberman's underlings. His name was Alex Miller. He's no longer in the Knesset. He was 28 and immigrated to Israel from Moscow. He was one of the youngest figures in the Knesset. And he told me that he was introducing this law because he was the head of Yisrael Beitenu, Lieberman's party's youth wing. And he said there's a youth movement in Israel, and this is what the youth want. I speak to them every day. This is why we're getting more and more popular. They want this law which will criminalize the Palestinian observance of the Nakba. The law has passed, and it now illegal in a diluted form, and it bans municipalities, Arab municipalities, from funding or participating in observances of the Nakba. This law is significant because it highlights what Israel, and in its current phase, sees as the key threat. The threat is not 67 and giving up occupied territory. That's over. They recognize that they are living in a single state and that the Green Line has been eviscerated. The threat is the narrative of 1948 and the idea of refugees returning and upending the Jewish majority. The threat is Palestinian civil society among Palestinian citizens. The threat is inside core Israeli cities. And that's where the battle is playing out in Israel, not necessarily in the occupied territories. And so there is a book that's been kind of deployed in the past few months, I think in a lot of ways to drown out my own book and to drown out Ali Abu Nema's book and to provide conflicted Jewish Americans with a narrative that can salve their conscience as they struggle to deal with supporting Israel in the right-wing Netanyahu era. It's My Promised Land by Ari Shavit. And Shavit, you know, it's an interesting book, partly because there are no citations or footnotes. It's why he's known as the Thomas Friedman of Israel, because Friedman has no footnotes in his books often, and just kind of, you just have to accept what he says on the authority of his mustache. And it's the same thing with Shavit. He just tells it to you like it is, and you're supposed to accept it. Shavit is, you know, a liberal Zionist from Israel's enlightened public. But what makes the book interesting to me is that he actually presents a very harrowing and clear and mostly accurate history of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian city of Lydda from the perspective of an Israeli unit, from the Haganah, the Zionist militia. I write about this in my book as well. And I'll explain why. And I think I present a slightly more accurate account. But nevertheless, it seems brave that Shavit did this, except when you read to the end of the chapter. And at the end of the chapter, Shavit declares that this needed to happen, that they needed to be ethnically cleansed for him to be born, and that in the end, he chooses to stand with the criminals. Because he too fears 48. And hopes they never return. Now, Shavit speaks of Lydda and the ethnic cleansing of Lydda as something that's in the past. But as we know from our own history, as William Faulkner said about the American past, the American South, that the past is never dead, it isn't even past. And the right wing in Israel understands something that Palestinians understand as well, which is that the Nakba has never ended. The Nakba is an ongoing, continuous process that will continue and deepen and expand as long as the status quo is guaranteed by the United States. So I wrote about Lydda in order for me to go back to the site of Palestinian ethnic cleansing, to a Palestinian neighborhood in Lydda, which is now known as Lod in Hebrew, to see Palestinians who had just had their homes demolished, who were Israeli citizens, but had had their entire neighborhood demolished because they built without permits. And Palestinians in Israel are almost completely unable to receive building permits. And so when I arrived to this neighborhood, which had been renamed by the families that lived there, the Abu Aid refugee camp, I found children attempting to do their homework in tents, just as refugee children had in 1948. And I met people standing around open fires trying to keep warm during the rainy season, and what they told me, one after the other, is that the days of 48 have come again. Every day is 1948 for Palestinians. As Ilan Pappé, the author of the seminal book on the seminal revisionist history on the foundation of the State of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, recently said, there hasn't been a day in the State of Israel's history without one act of ethnic cleansing or another. And so the right wing understands that the Nakba is continuing, but unlike Palestinians who want to, and unlike me, who would like to reverse the Nakba, who would like to prosecute it as the crime that it was, instead of providing aid and band-aids to the victims, the right wing wants to continue the Nakba to its completion. And so their mantra is finish 48. And that is why the right wing is receiving votes. In the most simple way possible, that's how I can explain why Lieberman is popular. And so we hear the call to finish 48 in the Praver plan, named after Benjamin Netanyahu's policy and planning chief, Ehud Praver. The Praver plan, it was a blueprint introduced in the Knesset calling for the expulsion of 40,000 to 70,000 Bedouin citizens of Israel from their ancestral communities to one of 5 Indian reservation-style townships, which represent the only towns built by the State of Israel for Arabs since its foundation. The Praver plan was a clear expulsion plan and is already underway, even though the Knesset failed to pass it. And I've witnessed ethnic cleansing in the Negev desert. 2 days ago, hundreds of families in the Negev, in unrecognized Bedouin communities, unrecognized because their residents, unlike me, do not possess J-positive blood and therefore can't receive state services, even though they are Israeli citizens, received eviction notices, real eviction notices, not the mock eviction notices that students handed out at NYU that caused campus Zionists to howl with indignation, but real eviction notices which pro-Israel students are silent about. And so we hear finish 48 in the Praver plan, and we hear finish 48 in the letter issued in 2010 by hundreds of state-appointed religious authorities, state-appointed rabbis, declaring in an abuse of Jewish law that it was illegal to rent apartments to non-Jews. And then we saw the call to finish 48 acted upon in Safat, the northern Israeli community, which has historically been a Palestinian city, as Palestinian students were attacked and a renter, a building owner who was renting to Palestinian students, found death threats posted on his door. This man was a Holocaust survivor who said that his tenants seemed like very nice boys and can't understand why these letters keep showing up on his door. We heard finish 48 in the accompanying letter issued by the rabbis' wives in another abuse of Judaism, declaring that it's illegal under Jewish law for Jews to date or have relationships with non-Jews. And we heard finish 48 in the cries of the anti-miscegenation movement, which this letter inspired. The anti-miscegenation movement headed by the group Lahava, which has been called by Deputy Transportation Minister Tzipi Hotovely to testify in the Knesset on the dangers of assimilation, which has received hundreds of thousands of shekels from the State of Israel, which is state-funded, which operates a hotline that allows callers to inform on interracial and interreligious couples, which places leaflets around Jerusalem warning Arab men not to speak to Jewish women under penalty of harsh, violent retaliation, which places posters around Jerusalem, which I've seen, of Arab men who are accused of making passes at Jewish women, identifying them as sex criminals, and which holds civil patrols on Tel Aviv beaches, warning Jewish women not to speak to Arab men, and which compelled the National Civil Service Administration of Israel a government bureau to bar religious Jewish women from volunteering in Israeli hospitals after 9 p.m. for fear that they will date Arab doctors, which any Jewish American should find peculiar because we have been raised to believe that it's good to date doctors. We don't hear about the call to finish 48 in Israeli educational curriculum, and that's why I spent so much time in my book writing about what's happening in Israeli classrooms, why I spent so much time with the Women of New Profile, this organization which is dedicated to educating young Jewish Israelis out of this belligerent mindset, of this hyper-nationalistic mindset which they've been indoctrinated into since age 4, which is dedicated to counseling young Jewish Israelis who want to refuse army service and get them out of their occupation duties, and whose members have been called in for interrogations, had their computers seized, and are under constant surveillance by the Shin Bet, the General Security Service of Israel. And I learned a lot of things from them about what's happening in Israeli classrooms. I learned how the Israeli Education Ministry seeks to abuse young minds and turn children into loyal occupation soldiers before they're able to develop the capacity for critical thinking, before they can become good citizens, before they can develop empathy. It starts at age 4. It's why we see so many Israeli Democracy Institute polls showing racist attitudes rising, especially among Israeli youth, that they have more racist attitudes than their parents and their grandparents, attitudes that compel them to declare rates of well over 50%, that they would refuse to sit in a classroom with an Arab, that they would refuse to live next door to an Arab. 35% of Jewish Israelis in the 2011 Israeli Democracy Institute poll declared support for detention centers for Arabs during wartime. And when is wartime in Israel? Well, it's conducted almost perpetually. So these are very disturbing polls, and we have to look in the schools to understand why these numbers are rising. 4-year-olds in Holon, as I documented in my book, in a bedroom community of Tel Aviv, were lined up before a blackboard that started with a message that led with a question: who wants to kill us? The question pointed to some answers. The historic enemies, the perceived enemies of the Jewish people: Egyptians, Persians, Nima, and Ali, and Palestinians, or it says Arabs and Nazis. Then another line points to another question: what do we need? That line points to the answer: we need a state. We need a Jewish state. Those are 4-year-olds. The Education Ministry in Israel has just announced that it will officialize the teaching of the Holocaust, of Jewish genocide in Europe, to 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds in kindergarten, at a time when they can barely, when they're just learning to walk and start to, expand their minds, but can't yet read. A friend of mine who does a lot of work with New Profile and teaches in Tel Aviv, teaches peace studies, something that has brought her a lot of criticism and scrutiny inside Israeli society. Gal Harmat told me that when she was in kindergarten, her teacher told her that she would have been turned into soap if this was Europe, and that anti-Semitism in the world was so profound that it could still happen. And so she had nightmares, and she said she couldn't sleep, and the first thing she wanted to do was find a strong male Israeli soldier to protect her, especially an Air Force pilot, because the Air Force are the elite within the Israeli army. And so these militaristic attitudes were instilled in her at a young age, and she said it took her until she was finished with adolescence and in her undergraduate studies, until she began to be able to educate herself out of it. By age 17, thousands of Jewish Israeli high schoolers are taken on a trip to prepare them for their army service, to prepare them to enter the army the next year, and to prepare them to participate in the occupation. And many of them are still very skeptical about what's going to happen over there, over the wall. They're taken to Auschwitz. on the March of the Living, which is a march, a procession featuring, besides these students, uniformed Israeli soldiers, uniformed Israeli policemen, and overflights by Israeli US-supplied F-16s over the site of Jewish genocide. The intention of these trips is clear. The Education Ministry monitors the attitudes of these students, polls them on their nationalism and support for the army before they go on these trips. 25% of Jewish Israeli high schoolers have gone on these trips, according to the Education Ministry. And after these trips, the Education Ministry has documented a marked rise in nationalism and support for the army. Because they're told that Jews had been slaughtered in the past and could be again unless they have a strong army. Yoav Shamir, the Israeli filmmaker, documents one of these trips in possibly the best documentary ever made about the exploitation of anti-Semitism. It's called Defamation, and you can watch it online. And I quote copiously from it in my book. There's one example of, there's one scene that really stuck with me. The students are goofing around, as any high schoolers would, and they're still skeptical about going into the army. By the end, they're taken into a gas chamber where Jews were killed, and they're forced to take on the personas of Jewish children in a candlelit ceremony who were killed in Auschwitz. And one after another, they break down in tears. And a young woman emerges from the gas chamber and tells Shamir that she's furious and wants to kill Nazis on camera. She says this, and he responds, "The Nazis are all dead." And she immediately snaps back at him, "But they have heirs." Who are the heirs to the Nazis? Well, Benjamin Netanyahu has made this clear when he made this clear at Bar Ilan University in October, when he stood before the entire faculty and entire student body in a major nationally televised speech and declared that the Palestinian national movement was directly involved in the final solution and responsible for the slaughter of 3,000 Jewish children in World War II Europe. A claim without any basis that I haven't seen anywhere except in the work of Alan Dershowitz, Netanyahu's friend. So what we're seeing with Netanyahu painting Palestinians as the heirs of the Nazis is, of course, an abuse of the Holocaust and a negation of its real lessons, which in my opinion is almost the ethical equivalent of Holocaust denial. The universal lessons of the Holocaust are forbidden in the Israeli official educational curriculum, and those of us who invoke them, as I did in my book, may face attacks from supporters of Israel. The universal lessons can be summed up very simply: never again to anyone. Never again to anyone is a phrase that threatens the very logic of the Jewish state, of the exclusivist Jewish state, and it is why it's forbidden. If the Jewish state wanted to produce more humanistic attitudes among its youth, it would take them to see what Israel has done to the Gaza Strip. Not Auschwitz, but it takes them to Auschwitz for a clear reason. And so we're in the spring season right now. And this is a very significant time in Israeli society. It is a time of holidays, very intensely observed holidays which occur one after another. Passover, the observance of the Jewish exodus from slavery in Egypt, when we declare that in every generation they have risen up to destroy us. Then Yom HaShoah, the observance of the Holocaust, the Shoah, when Israeli legislators stand up in the Knesset and read off the names of their relatives who were killed. And every Israeli citizen is compelled to stand wherever they are in the middle of traffic in a supermarket and listen to a siren blare for 2 minutes. A very intense ceremony. Then Memorial Day, when Israel observes the soldiers who have died and are told that they've died in combat, even though the highest cause of death in the Israeli army is suicide and fratricide, and not deaths in combat. And then finally, Independence Day, which represents the deliverance from thousands and thousands of years of unremitting, continuous oppression and persecution of the Jewish people, embodied by the Jewish state. The Jewish state is their deliverance. And for many, it is a time to remember. It's a time to celebrate, just like our holidays here. But for others, especially for the most extreme supporters of this right-wing coalition, this right-wing government, it is a time to hate, and it is a time for blood vengeance. The Shin Bet, Israel's General Security Service, has just warned that there could be a massive hate crime and massive wave of hate crimes against Christians when the Pope visits Israel. There have been a wave of attacks in northern Israel, attempts to torch a mosque in al-Fahim in the Arab Triangle, the largest town whose residents Lieberman has called to be transferred. Incidentally, the World Zionist Organization has just called for planting 100,000 Jewish colonists in northern Israel to quote-unquote balance the Arab population. And we've seen the graves at Deir Yassin, the site of Palestinian destruction, where over 200 Palestinian women and children were massacred in 1948, spray painted with the increasingly ubiquitous phrase, "Death to Arabs," which represents the second vandalism of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin has been converted into a mental institution by the State of Israel, and its homes now house patients who are suffering from Jerusalem syndrome. The wave of price tag attacks, of hate crimes, of what the State Department in the US over Israeli objections now describes as terrorism has gotten so bad that Abe Foxman's Anti-Defamation League has felt compelled to condemn them. The State of Israel is up, and the government of Israel, the Justice Ministry, is so terrified of the expansion of these wave of hate crimes that it is seeking to implement penalties that it usually imposes on Palestinians and Palestinian rock throwers in the occupied territory, detention without trial. I think if they want to stop these hate crimes, they should start by changing the curriculum in kindergarten. That's a good place to start. They should start with the minds of Jewish Israeli children who are also victims of this crisis and who are victims also of Zionism, but not in a physical sense, as Palestinians are, in a psychological sense. We also have to remember that there are attacks on non-Jewish Africans who live in Israel. 50,000 non-Jewish Africans are living in Israel seeking refugee status. 2 days after Independence Day in 2012, an African kindergarten was torched in Tel Aviv. The perpetrator was let off scot-free. It led straight to anti-African riots days later, with key Israeli legislators, including Miri Regev, the chair of the Interior Committee, declaring before 1,000 anti-African protesters in Tel Aviv that Africans represent a cancer in Israel's national body. An opinion that the Israeli Democracy Institute found 52% of Jewish Israelis agree with, and they found that a plurality of Jewish Israelis agreed with violence against African non-Jewish refugees. Eli Yishai, then the Interior Minister, pledged to make the lives of Africans miserable, and the government has proceeded to do just that. The roundups have begun thanks to a new law, which has been amended, that originally applied to Palestinians, passed in 1953, the Infiltration Prevention Act, which labeled Palestinians who attempted to return to their property who were refugees infiltrators. The amendment to the law declares African refugees not refugees deserving of protection under the UN Convention of Refugees, which Israel signed, but as infiltrators themselves. They can now be picked up anywhere at any time, detained without charges, and held indefinitely in a detention center in the Negev desert, which Israel, the State of Israel, refers to as an open accommodation center. It is called Holot. And in my book, I wrote a chapter about it called The Concentration Camp, because it has been referred to as a concentration camp by even right-wing Israeli legislators. Because Arnon Sofer, the Israeli government aide and advisor, who is known as the key demographer in Israel, who the government consults on strategies for reducing the non-Jewish population in Israeli-controlled territory, has produced a blueprint for reducing the African population. It was presented to the government in 2012, and it calls for rikuz. Rikuz is Hebrew for concentration. It is the same word featured on the website of the Yad Vashem Memorial Foundation Memorial Museum, which is Israel's Holocaust Memorial Museum, to refer to the treatment of Jews in occupied Europe. In Holot, my colleague Alison Dager of Mondoise has documented extremely harsh conditions. And she told me recently that she herself, after seeing the treatment of these refugees who were being interned there, as Japanese Americans were interned in California during World War II for possessing what it was known then as enemy race blood, she told me that she's very careful with their language, but she has no choice but to refer to it as a concentration camp. She knows of no other title that can be applied to it, that there has been no medical review in the camp for 3 months. The rules of the camp are as follows. You're technically allowed to leave, but you have to check in 3 times a day. There are about 500 to 1,000 people there now, and the population is growing as the roundups increase. But there's nowhere to go, and you're not allowed to work. You're only allowed to work in the camp for pennies doing janitorial work. And you have to be locked down in the camp at night. You have to be segregated from the Israeli public at night for fear that you will assimilate. Many of these Africans speak really good Hebrew, much better than Alan Dershowitz or Abe Foxman, and are really productive members of Israeli society. That's a threat. And so this situation kind of reminds me of something that we thought we had left behind in the past in the United States. In the 20s and 30s, there were communities across the US which imposed ordinances to keep their communities white. And they forbade the presence of African Americans after dark. The historian James Lowen has called them sundown towns. And we saw them from Seattle to Portland, which are still very white, to Montgomery County, just outside Washington, D.C. With the Holot Open Accommodation Center, Netanyahu has transformed Israel into the world's largest sundown town. Someone named Mutassim Ali, who is the head of the largest African rights organization in Tel Aviv, is someone I met on my last reporting trip to Israel. He was then running for Tel Aviv City Council. He wanted to be a part of Israeli society. He speaks, perfect Hebrew, perfect English. He's from Darfur. He fled from genocide. He fled from the Janjaweed. And he was forced to lead a massive general strike of African refugees, filling the streets of Tel Aviv, demanding refugee rights for fear that they will be rounded up and sent into Holot and then sent back to Sudan, where they can be killed and where many have already been sent back and died. And during Yom HaShoah, one of these holidays that I discussed in the spring season, Mutassim Ali heard the siren, the 2-minute siren, and he remembered this is Holocaust Memorial Day, and he remembered that he had gone to Yad Vashem and that he had even gone to Auschwitz and talked about Darfur and told visitors there about his own experience and about the need to combat genocide and human rights crimes everywhere. And so he called for a Holocaust memorial ceremony in Levinsky Park, which is where the non-Jewish African population is generally concentrated in South Tel Aviv, in this very poor neighborhood where anti-African riots occurred, where they're forced to sleep in the open and live off of often donated food. And he said that the only rule for this protest is that the only sign allowed is never again. So the protest occurred, and within minutes, Ali and the other, the memorial was observed, and within minutes, Ali and his fellow non-Jewish African refugees found themselves surrounded by right-wing thugs who threatened to attack them and drove them from the park. This week, Ali was placed on a bus and sent to the Holot detention camp and is now interned there indefinitely. And his plight as a refugee fleeing genocide continues perpetually in the state of Israel, the state which claims to embody the lessons of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, for Palestinians ethnic cleansing continues before our very eyes. And the Israeli government introduces its plans to do more, to annex 60% of the West Bank and do away with the Palestinian state. And in our own backyard, we find on Roosevelt Island one of the key institutions involved in this process of occupation and dispossession is going to erect a gleaming institution, and we're supposed to celebrate this. What this institution represents and the partnership between Cornell and Technion represents is the sustainability of occupation and Israeli apartheid, the profitability of apartheid, the fact that Israel can go on like this indefinitely unless we get in the way, unless we create massive external pressure to get in the way. The Technion has been intimately involved in the development of drone and robotic technology, the kind of technology that makes the occupation more manageable and more possible. We have to remember that the State of Israel invented the drone during the first invasion and occupation of Lebanon and weaponized the drone decades later. That Israel is the top exporter of drones in the world, mostly to the developing world. That Israel recently sold 4 drones to Brazil for it to police its own citizens during the World Cup. The drones were created were invented and pioneered because during the first invasion of Lebanon, Israel was suffering too many casualties. They needed robots to do the fighting. The casualties were leading to anti-war protests inside Israel. They couldn't handle this. With the implementation of drone technology, the anti-war protests have disappeared. The occupation has become more sustainable. The Technion has even invented a remote-controlled bulldozer to bulldoze Palestinian homes from miles away, remotely controlled. And that's why this gathering is so significant, and the activism that you're doing is so significant. It is such an integral part of BDS, because BDS is about applying a price tag to apartheid and putting a price tag on occupation. Because the US, if not confronted, will continue to send your taxpayer money, your tax dollars, through this financial feeding tube straight to the Israeli occupation. And so BDS was a Palestinian call in 2005 by 174 Palestinian civil society organizations for the boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel and companies and institutions involved in human rights crimes, occupation, and institutional discrimination against Palestinians. And it calls also for the honoring of Resolution 194, which, interestingly, Israel signed as a condition for its admittance to the UN General Assembly, for the honoring of this resolution, which calls for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And so Palestinians have issued this call, and the call is growing, it's gathering momentum, and it's come to our community here with the Technion. It's been forced on us, a decision has been forced on us. Are we going to comply with a sustainable and profitable occupation, or are we going to get in the way? And I guess with that question, I'll wrap it up and take your questions. Thanks a lot. Let me get out of here.
Okay, before we go into the question and comment period, and by the way, it's not just questions and answers. You can also make a statement if you'd like to. You'll line up at that microphone over there and be taken in order.